Hey guys, how's it going? Roger says hey. Scarlett's panting under the desk right now. We're back with the Great War, weeks 11 and 12 today. So it looks like we're going to start off talking about some Christmas stuff in World War One. But before we get into the video, you guys know what time it is. It's comment time. First comment is from Grofili. He makes it into comment time almost every week. He leaves really good comments. U-boat is derived from the German term Untersee Boot, under the sea boat. It is just the standard German term for that type of vessel, and only in English has turned into the name for specifically the German boats. For a German like me, all submarines are U-boots. U-boots. I didn't know that that's what U-boat stood for, so it's good to know. Donald B1 says, this has certainly been recommended to you before, but seeing the mud of the trenches up close reminds me that They Shall Not Grow Old is an excellent film to catch up on World War I. It's a recent documentary that takes footage from the war and technologically modernizes it, adds color, sound effects, etc. The result is astonishing. That actually sounds really, really good. I will make sure I bookmark that and keep that in mind. Michael says that technology created the need for trenches, and technology removed the viability of trenches. Kind of ironic, I guess. Trenches and foxholes were still employed by infantry for defensive positions in World War II. However, the greater mobility of armies made them less permanent. I am, I guess, pretty ignorant on the use of trenches in warfare. I mean, I've not really studied it in any detail, and I've not ever been in the military, so I don't really know how they use trenches today. But a lot of you in some of the other comments did let me know that trenches are still used, just in, I guess, more specific situations. I do know about foxholes. I mean, all of the World War II movies I've seen soldiers sitting in foxholes. You know, I know that they use those. I don't know if I've ever seen a World War II movie where there was an actual trench used, so that's probably why I don't associate it with World War II. It's in 1860, says the French invented the hot air balloon and made the first unmanned flight as soon as 1783. Now, hot air balloons, I did see them used in the Napoleonic Wars. There was an episode that actually showed a painting of soldiers up in a hot air balloon, like overlooking a battlefield, I'm guessing to see where the enemy positions were and so forth. He goes on to say that France was one of the most important nations in the development of aviation, until its entire aviation industry was brought down during the Second World War, forcing the French to restart from scratch after the war. I think it's not far-fetched to consider France as the birthplace of aviation. Yeah, all of this is new information to me. I had really no idea. Melvin Collins says, your look of shock when seeing the horses was a picture. This is absolutely why I find the First World War fascinating. The clash of the 19th and the 20th century is just so interesting. That's a really good way to put it, actually. The clash of the 19th and 20th centuries. I agree with you. It's one of the most intriguing parts of it for me as well. Holtus says the colonial possessions in Africa are an important aspect of the dynamics between the European powers. Britain and France had a major head start and wanted to keep it that way, while younger and uprising nations like Germany and Italy were scrambling for the few remaining territories. A wish to prevent Germany from expanding as colonial empire was an important reason why Britain allied with their old archenemy France. You know, guys, the whole colonial history in Africa, I've told you before, I am clueless about. Just have never really studied it. It was probably mentioned in history class or something, but again, it would have gotten a very brief mention, and I probably wouldn't remember anything about it. So I think because the United States did not have the same involvement in Africa as a lot of European countries did, Americans are probably a little less aware of what took place. But definitely something. I mean, it sounds like it was a huge undertaking, you know, in history, so it's probably something I should know about, so we'll definitely have to get to that. Alright, so we're going to get into the first episode on week 11 today. This is titled Back for Christmas, The Illusion of a Short War, and I've heard over and over again in this series Indy Nidell talk about everybody thought that the war would be over by Christmas. In hindsight, that seems like an insane thought to have, that a world war would be over in like 4 months or whatever.
The war of rapid victories was over, and the continuous war in the filthy trenches had begun, ending the rush of optimism with which the warring nations had begun the war, and bringing in a heavy mood of disillusionment that would crush the spirits of the millions of men fighting and dying. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week we saw the Germans laying siege to Antwerp, the last bastion of Belgian resistance, while in the east, the Russians were laying siege to the Austrians at Przemysl, the Austrian army now behind Russian lines. Another Russian army was on an endless march through Poland, but at the Aisne, in France. Both sides were stuck in the mud, losing thousands of men every day as the endless battle continued. And in Africa, the Germans were tying down the South African troops, preventing them from joining the fight in Europe. On the Western Front, Kaiser Wilhelm himself had visited his German troops at Chamonix, telling them that they would indeed be home by Christmas. And in Paris, after the Battle of the Marne a few weeks ago, there had been matching hopes for a French victory. However, in the French army, Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre abandoned his hopes of outflanking the Germans and winning a spectacular victory. He saw that his best hope now was just holding the line, preventing the Germans from achieving their own encircling maneuvers. But the Germans, under Prince Ruprecht, were coming on strong this week. Now, Ruprecht was the Crown Prince of Bavaria, the last one actually, and though he got his appointment as commander of the German 6th Army because of his title, he proved to be one of the best commanders in the entire German army, remaining on the western.
I'm assuming that Bavaria is one of the regions in Germany, kind of like Prussia was at this point.
Front for the entire war and eventually reaching the rank of field marshal. He nearly managed to surround the French at Lille and Arras on October 4th. General Ferdinand Foch was in charge of dealing with this threat. Foch's main contribution turned out to be one of morale, his iron determination, and his absolute insistence that there be no retreat. Soldiers must hold or die, which they did, and a major German push on Arras was knocked back. By the evening of the 6th, the French line was stable. The Germans then turned their full attention to the siege of Antwerp, Belgium, where they had been shelling the surrounding forts since September 26th. Now, 8,000 British troops were sent to Antwerp on October 4th and 5th, which sounds great, but many of these troops were raw recruits and had never even held, let alone fired, a rifle. These men were merely a stopgap measure, though. For a further 22,000 British troops, a full professional division was now on its way. Once they got there, the Belgians, with 30,000 British troops to defend them, thought victory had suddenly arrived, and the Germans were slowly pushed back. This was only an illusion, though, for the French government suddenly decided not to send any French troops, as they had promised, and this lack of support caused the British to hold back. This was probably a good thing, as the British and Belgians had no realistic hope of defeating the Germans at Antwerp without French help. On October 7th, the German army began pounding the city of Antwerp itself, not just the surrounding forts, with 17-inch howitzers. The defenders, quite literally, had no means of counterattack. Their guns just couldn't reach, and the British would not move forward without the missing French support. On October 8th, the British began to evacuate, and on October 10th, the tired and battered Belgians could take no more, and King Albert, who personally commanded the Belgian army, was forced to flee the city. The long siege of Antwerp had dashed British and Belgian hopes of breaking out and claiming victory. Disillusioned, they now only resolved to hold back the Germans long enough to move troops from their posts northeast of Paris to the Channel ports and prevent the Germans from reaching the sea, which they did. In the east, in Poland, disillusionment was spreading as well on both sides, as the technically superior German forces faced the enormous mass of the Russian army, now on the move in a seemingly endless, spirit-crushing march to positions along the Vistula River. On this day, October 9, 1914, the German army captured the Russian order of battle from a Russian officer, and they realized they had 18 divisions against what was now 60 Russian divisions in 2 armies in Poland, and even superior arms were not going to give Germany a decisive victory. So the new German battle plan for the moment was just to follow up the Russian columns. Really, that was it. Nobody wants to attack somebody that's more than 3 times as strong as them. You really have to pick your battles. And picking his battles is just what German General von Hindenburg did, winning a series of carefully chosen small victories during these weeks, harassing the Russians throughout Poland, and very importantly, keeping the Russian army too busy to help out with what was going on further south in Galicia, where the Russians were still laying siege to the Austrian army at the fortress of Przemysl. When the siege had begun 2 weeks ago, the Russians had been unable to bring in their heavy artillery because of the mud surrounding the fortress. But they had made a full-scale assault anyway, hoping to win before the Austrians could bring in reinforcements. It was futile and merely resulted in 40,000 Russian casualties. Now, the lands that these armies, whether Austrian, German, or Russian, were now fighting in were mostly inhabited by minority peoples of the empires, who were often unsatisfied with their status within their country. What we see throughout the rest of the war is warring nations making promises and hints to disaffected or dependent peoples to try to win them over in order to gain an advantage. The Russian provinces of Poland, which had been annexed in the 1700s, were being overrun by the German army under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and many Poles in that region were beginning to ask the question, would the Germans grant Poland autonomy? Polish soldiers were also fighting alongside the Austrians, hoping that an Austro-Hungarian victory would re-establish an independent Poland. The empire encouraged this belief, and the Polish Legion, which became an independent part of the imperial army, was formed by Józef Pilsudski in late August. Pilsudski, later Marshal Pilsudski, would go on after the war to be the leader of an independent Poland in the 20s and 30s. Being a minority in 1914, much like today in many places, most often involved a history of being hated and violently repressed for who you were, being invaded repeatedly over the years, or being murdered for your beliefs, and at best, only having a token say in the control of your lives and lands. But with the Autumn War came a change, as the reality of a seemingly endless war sank in among the powers, a reality that led them to grasp for any advantage and to search for new allies in perhaps unlikely places. The promise of independence, or even just
Wait, what did
citizenship—
that sign say? Now then, you single men, don't let Grandpa join first. Alright, well that's one way to do it.
Allies in perhaps unlikely places. The promise of independence, or even just citizenship, in exchange for your allegiance is a powerful one, and one that is still relevant today. Many of the minority peoples asked to fight in 1914 had never before even had a glimmer of hope of independence, and so they fought, based on the promises of a brighter future for their people. Unfortunately, most of those promises turned out to be empty, hollow words, and millions more men would die for lies.
I mean, it reminds me of the American Revolutionary War, where they tried to, I think, get African American slaves to fight for them, and then they would promise them freedom after that. And then I think the British and the Americans both did that, and I think both sides, especially the Americans, but I think both kind of failed to deliver on their promises the way that they had, sold it to the slaves. I guess some things just never change, right?
So the Russians now encouraged all those Poles in the Russian domains not crawling with Germans and Austrians to fight with the Russians, also supposedly to further their nationalistic ambitions. Poles were now fighting against Poles. Nearly 2 million Poles fought in the war on both sides, with some 450,000 of them dying, mostly fighting to gain their independence. Britain was even trying to enlist the Sheikh of Mecca with the promise of future Arab control of chunks of the Ottoman Empire, but you also see minorities encouraged in various other ways. Jews in Russia, for example, were now allowed to rise to the ranks of officers in the army to encourage them to join up and fight, although they still did not receive full citizenship, and let's face it, were often murdered by Russian townspeople who needed a scapegoat for Russian military failures. And there certainly had been.
Okay, I didn't know that there was that relationship between Jews and Russia. I never thought to put Jews and Russia together at all, actually. I don't know why. I don't associate Jews with Russia.
Had been their share of them, especially the colossal ones at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes weeks ago. Actually, 4 of the 5 major warring nations had now seen their share of both victory and defeat. But the 5th, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, had seen nothing but military failures riddled with incompetence. And there the Austrians were, at the end of the week, still under siege in Przemysl, with the Russians pressing them. The northern Russian armies were still on their endless march to their positions along the Vistula in Poland. And as for the Germans, after clever maneuvering, at the end of the week, Hindenburg was only 19 kilometers from Krakow. In the west, the last major Belgian town had fallen, and the 80,000 men remaining in the Belgian field army had retreated. But the siege had given British and French troops time to move their positions, and the final possibility for the Germans to outflank them was disappearing. The war was going to be long and bloody, and all sides now knew it. There would be no encirclement in the west, no Russian colossus triumphant in the east, no glory for the empire in the southeast. There would only be continuous battles in the muddy trenches with thousands of new recruits dying each day, or endless freezing marches with soldiers dying by the roadsides in the mud and snow. This was modern war. See you next week.
Okay, well, I guess the Christmas stuff was more of a figure of speech. I guess we're not quite up to that point yet here, but alright, so we're going to look at week 12's episode now. This one's called Learning from Napoleon, Russia, the Underestimated Enemy. This should be interesting since I did do the Napoleonic Wars series. I might have some idea about what's going on here.
So far this war, things had looked grim for the Russians. They had unwillingly entered the war in the first place, and the colossal defeats at the battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes had convinced the German and Austro-Hungarian armies that Russia's army was both backward and incompetent. But beginning this week, they would learn that Russia was no pushover at all and had two enviable assets: men and space. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week we saw Antwerp fall to the Germans, and the Belgians and the British retreated into Flanders to build their defenses and try to prevent the Germans from pushing to the sea. While the
Flanders Fields, that's where that is, okay. I did know it was in that region, but I didn't know exactly where it was. It was right there on the English Channel, straddling the French and Belgian border, okay. A while back, I did listen to that song. I forgot what video it was in, actually. No, it was at the tail end of one of the Gallipoli videos that I did, that they sang the Flanders Fields song.
While the French held the line further south. In the east, the Austrians were under siege in their fortress at Przemysl, awaiting relief. The Russians further north were marching to positions to cross the Vistula and attack Germany, and the Germans were now only 20 kilometers from Warsaw. Here was the general German plan in the east: to strike, with Austrian help, at Warsaw and Ivangorod and outflank the Russian army there, while the Austrians were being relieved from the siege further south. The Russians, after weeks of disastrous marching through the mud, had finally reached their crossing point, built a bridgehead, and began to cross. The Germans reached Warsaw on October 12th, but their attacks were thrown back, and there would be no outflanking. See, the Germans had seen the Russian march and its colossal mismanagement and believed that Russia was weak around Warsaw. But what they didn't realize was that the Russian armies were arriving and entering the battle in sections, and more of them were coming. So we see that before October 15th, the Germans had the upper hand, but after that, not so much. Soon there was no prospect of German General von Hindenburg getting a decisive victory in view of the seemingly endless Russian reinforcements, now coming from as far away as Central Asia and Siberia. It's important to realize that by this point, there were actually 4 fronts in the east: German-Russian in East Prussia, German-Russian-Austrian along the Vistula, Russian-Austrian along the San, and Russian-Austrian in the Carpathians, and the middle 2 of those were now a concerted operation. So along the San River, the Austrians had finally managed to break out, relieved by General Boroyevich von Bonya on October the 11th. Now this was timed to coincide with Hindenburg's German advances towards Warsaw further north. Boroyevich, eventually a field marshal, was a brilliant defensive strategist who later showed what he could do on the Italian front. But for now, he had to deal with his chief of staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf. Konrad thought that the combined forces of the Austrians from within Przemysl and Boroyevich's relief army could beat the Russians. So on October 14th, he ordered his men to try and cross the San River and engage the enemy. It was a catastrophe. His men were bombarded not only by the Russians, but also by their own side because of miscommunication. And there were no pontoons to make bridges, so they had to use boats to ferry themselves over. And since one of the Austrian commanders thought a marching band might improve morale, he had one playing on the Austrian shore. Now imagine being one of those poor Austrian soldiers, trying to cross the river in a boat while being bombarded by both the enemy and your own men. Your comrades are dying around you by the dozens while a marching band on the shore plays inspiring music for you. It was truly a scene from a madhouse. So now that we've imagined being an Austrian soldier, let's imagine that we live in Poland in October 1914. The Germans march in, then the Russians, sometimes the Austrians, then the Germans again, back and forth and up and down. By now, the basic situation in the towns of Russian Poland was total anarchy. At least the German officers had some training in civic leadership, which their Russian counterparts lacked completely. There sprang up a huge black market in this region for liquor and food, as you may guess, but also weapons, uniforms, anything that the locals could scavenge from a battlefield, or sadly, get from a soldier in exchange for food. Even winter clothes, with winter soon here. Really, the troops were so desperate for food, they were selling their winter boots, knowing that Russian winter was coming in just a few short weeks.
Wow.
Another effect of anarchy in Russian Poland was that when the German troops arrived, the local populations often turned against the Jews, claiming they were secretly sympathetic to the German cause, and they began a series of atrocities against them. Shops and synagogues were looted and burned, and Jews were hanged every day. The idea, though, that Jews were sympathetic to the German cause totally ignored the fact that 250,000 Jews were serving in the Russian army at the time. And that army was finally beginning to turn itself around, not only because of its enormous size, but because Russia had a way of approaching battle that none of the other warring nations had. See, Russia had no problem giving up land to the enemy and using space to fight a war instead of just force. This had always held true. Think of Napoleon marching on Russia 100 years ago and the disaster it ended in for him. Russia had thousands upon thousands of miles of land, and if the enemy made some gains or even took a whole province, so what? It would simply be retaken when the enemy stretched itself too thin and became exhausted. And how does an enemy counter this when the enemy can't think like that? None of the other armies had that luxury. It was immoral for the Germans to cede any of East Prussia to the Russians. It was humiliating for the Austrians that Russia now held Austrian ground and cities. And it was absolutely unthinkable for the Belgians and the French to give up an inch of their land to the Germans in the West, where the war for a decisive victory was now a war for roads, villages, and hills. The race to the sea had been going on for weeks as the Germans tried to outflank the British, French, and Belgians, and vice versa. The trench lines grew ever longer as neither side was able to gain an advantage, and both sides were forced to dig in. Battles that would rage for weeks began in places like La Bassée, Armentières, and Messines as the lines grew further and further north. On the 11th, the Germans began bombarding Lille, which surrendered on the 13th and would remain in German hands for the next 4 years. This part of France and Belgium, called Flanders, was still mostly untouched by the war, and when, on October 14th, some British forces entered the town of Ypres, it seemed like a nice, quiet little country town. They promptly began calling it Wipers. The next day, they marched east a few miles and made preparations to make a quick...
Oh, because that's kind of like what it looks like it smelled like. Okay. I was like, what?
The next day, they marched east a few miles and made preparations to make a quick advance on the Germans as soon as the rest of the British Expeditionary Force turned up. No one realized yet that this quaint little patch of Belgian countryside would become the gravesite for over 200,000 British soldiers during the next 4 years. British soldiers were going to a watery grave this week as well, as the German submarine U-9, already infamous for dispatching 3 British cruisers in 1 hour, torpedoed the Hawk in the North Sea. 525 British sailors drowned. Only 21 were saved. However, as the war in the seas grew and developed, the British gained a lucky advantage. Russia sent them a German Navy signal book it had captured when the German signalman about to destroy it was killed by an artillery shell. Because of this, British cryptographers in future had a leg up decoding wireless messages and finding their adversaries at sea. So there we are at the end of the week, with the British arriving at a nice quiet town called Ypres at the northern end of the miles and miles of trenches. The Austrians sinking into despair as their maneuvers once again proved disastrous. The Germans realizing that Russia was nowhere near as incompetent as they'd thought, and the Russians bringing more and more and ever more men to bear down on the Germans along the Vistula River. Germany and Austria knew, of course, that Russia had the population advantage, but they'd gone to war confident that their advantages in tactics and equipment would more than make up for this. And for the Germans, at least so far, it had. But nobody quite realized the depth of the Russian reinforcements. And as the enemy army's initial forces were depleted, That depth, as well as the use of the endless open space, had finally made the Russian army a real force to be reckoned with. And over the next 2 months, hundreds of thousands of men would die on the enormous battlefields of the Eastern Front. If you'd like to see how the trench warfare...
I feel like every single episode of this ends with him showing like dead bodies laying on the ground, either in trenches or on like railroad tracks or something, and he said, and this week ends with however many died. That's like the stock ending for every single one of these episodes here. I mean, it's not funny that they died, but you know, it's just like, it just hit me like almost every single video I've watched so far ends that way. So the big thing out of this that I got was, there was the point about Russia using the land advantage, like the openness of the land. And he mentioned this in one of the previous episodes too, that they didn't care if, you know, certain towns or whatever were taken in Russia, because they had the room to maneuver around and come back and retake the town when they were ready to do that. So that's a really interesting strategic advantage to Russia that nobody's ever really laid out before. I guess that makes it a little bit easier to understand how they were able to defeat Napoleon, and I guess in World War II, they probably did the same thing, you know? The story about the band playing while they were crossing the river too was hilarious. I want to see that scene in the movie. I would love to see that, actually. So it sounds like we're kind of in the fall right here, heading into winter maybe. So what's the date here? Oh, we're in October. Okay, so these episodes we're watching are set in October 1914. So, alright, so 2 more good episodes from Indy 9L. We'll look forward to episodes, or weeks 13 and 14 next time. If you guys want to comment below, I don't know if I had any questions. I did have a question about Bavaria in this. There wasn't a whole lot of content on this that I had questions about. It was more of me just taking in information. So, I guess there are less questions to answer this time around for me, but I'm sure you guys can add some, you know, some interesting stuff down in the comments. I look forward to reading all of that, and a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Check out my social media links in the description and pinned comment. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time for weeks 13 and 14.